Good morning. I want to thank you guys for all coming out on Saturday morning to hear Anthony Ray. We're very pleased to have him here. He has been researching his family, which is the Berryessas, for many years. He has new material for us. So he spoke once before on the Berryessas, and now he's expanding a little bit to the effect of the Bear Flag revolt on California's, in addition to stories about his family. So I also wanted to tell you that this is our membership year starts now. Hold on a second. So stay. Maybe it's not gonna stay. Oops, hold on. Anyway, so the membership year starts now. We've slightly raised our individual membership to $50, and for a family, it's 100 this year. And we thank you for being members. We really appreciate it. We are hoping to open the museum in September. I know we keep pushing it back, but it's a massive undertaking. You probably, if you got our newsletter, you saw some of those did you knows. The other part of that is that we're integrating all the exhibits into our website. So it's more than just did you know, it's for people that are interested in how we how we wrote the exhibits, and because with exhibits it's only a snapshot of what the whole story is. So we're going to have a lot of the backup material on the website, and all those things are time consuming, and we are a small organization. In addition, we're going to use more photos, more material from our archives. It's really quite exciting. And so with that, I'd like to introduce Anthony. It's a pleasure. This is our first time meeting because last time it was in Zoom, and many of you probably saw that also. So thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. So nice to be here with you today. I'm going to get my script up and get a little bit situated. So as a very quick introduction, as I get this pulled up, I've had to cut down a lot on this. There were so many things I wanted to share with you, but if I had done that, if I had shared the entire thing, we'd be here for about 2 hours. I don't think we all want to be sitting here for 2 hours. I'd like to thank Patricia for inviting me to be here and to present my research to you. It's based on a paper I've been wanting to write for a very long time, and I finally took the time to do so this past semester as part of my degree, which is on the history of the Reyes de Haro murder, which occurred in 1846. I began researching my genealogy. Let's see how I'm going to do this. There we go. I began researching my genealogy in 2002, when I was 11 years old. In January of that year, my great-grandfather died when we attended his funeral in Nogales, Arizona. And we attended his funeral in Nogales, Arizona. And I can clearly remember being at the wake the night before the funeral, and then the next day being at the Catholic church on the hill that overlooks the town. Old photos were passed around, stories were shared, and my interest in sepia-colored memories commenced. Later that year, my uncle and aunt who live in St. George, Utah, visited our family in Palmdale in Southern California, and my aunt mentioned to us that she was researching my grandmother's family. I was fortunate to grow up with all of my grandparents and 6 of my great-grandparents still living when I was 4. As a result, I was able to hear many stories from our family history. So when my aunt came to visit, I was already open to the idea of genealogy. I just didn't realize what genealogy was. As she described the things she had found on my great-grandmother, my curiosity began to grow. I asked her how I could do my own research, and she mentioned websites such as Family Search, Ancestry, and Roots Web. I don't even know if Roots Web is still around. As I began to research my family names online, I also started digging around my grandparents' houses. I looked in boxes and filing cabinets and dresser drawers and sheds and stacks of papers, and I found so much, including hundreds of letters written by my grandparents, great-grandparents, great-great-grandparents. I found countless photos, I found documents, I found so much that told me about the people that came before me. Even as I'm describing this to you all, that feeling of excitement comes back to me of looking through things and wanting to find documents. Here is one document in particular that sparked my greatest curiosity. It was the baptismal certificate of my great-grandfather. The name was listed as John Andres Peña and his parents as Prudencio Peña, and you'll see Rufina Berryessa. The last name really caught me. Rufina Berryessa. When my grandma was born, her father, Andrew, was 59. He died when she was only 5 years old. So my grandma didn't really know too much about her family because her father passed when she was so young. I asked my grandma if she had heard any stories about her grandmother, and the only thing she knew was that her name was Rufina. I was starting from scratch, essentially. When I entered the name Berryessa in the Google search bar, so many hits came up. A lot of them had to do with a lake near Napa. But as I sifted through online articles about this lake and a valley named Berryessa and a neighborhood in San Jose named Berryessa, I started to find other bits of information. I found articles about Spanish soldiers and ranchos and even murders, as we'll talk about today. I'd never heard any of this growing up, nor had my grandma. And I began to realize that this name, Berryessa, was rather significant and that there was a lot of information about them online. One of these was the story of the murder of Jose de los Reyes Berryessa and his two young relatives, Francisco and Ramon de Haro, by Kit Carson and John Fremont in 1846. As I began to read more, I found that the Berryessa de Haro murders were significant for being one of the first violent acts committed by the Americans against the Californios, signaling their demise as a cultural majority and initiating them as the other. I believe this was a turning point in how Americans treated Californios. But there is a lot that led to this. Even though the murders held a place in the memories of many Californios, the details of the story have been obscured through time. While this story has survived in many histories as a paragraph or footnote, it has never been told in its entirety. Why did it happen? What were the circumstances leading up to the murders? Who were the people involved? This presentation will recount this sad history by reintroducing the main characters and by listening to their stories. In my research, I believe that understanding the social dynamics is crucial to understanding the significance of events. This also includes and involves reconstructing families. Now, I will say up front that there are probably connections that I still haven't realized or that I won't have the time to discuss in this story. But currently, I think we have a good understanding of what the social landscape looked like. I would like to show these two slides before we delve into the meat of the lecture, and I'll show them again a little later on, because understanding the connections will make some of this a little more significant. This first chart shows exactly how Berryessa and the de Haros were related. Often in accounts, they're listed as nephews and uncle. And in Spanish and Mexican society, it is proper to call anyone who's older than you, even maybe a few days or months who's older than you, your tío, your uncle. I just went to, I've been on a almost month-long research trip, and I'm at the tail end of it now. But I was in Mexico a few weeks ago doing some research in Hermosillo, and when I was visiting my grandma's first cousin, I don't call him primo, cousin, even though he's my cousin, I call him tío. So we can see here, we can see the exact relationship between Berryessa and the de Haros, and it connects through Reyes, who's on the far left, through his wife, Maria Zacarias Bernal. And we find that Zacarias and her first cousin, that is the relationship right there. So through their grandparents, And then another character we'll discuss shortly is Jose Santos, who is there at the bottom far left. And then we have the De Haro twins right here. So Santos and the De Haro twins would have been second cousins. This probably is going to be, it's very difficult sometimes to look at a chart and to immediately realize the connection. So we'll come back to this in a little bit, but I wanted to at least show you how they're related, because it's important to realize that they weren't uncle and nephews, but rather distant cousins. And then we have another connection toward the end of the lecture that I think is also important between the Castro family and the Berryessa family. We see the common ancestors at the top, Nicolas Berryessa and Gertrudis Peralta, who arrived here with the De Anza party and were married at Mission Santa Clara. They had several children, and the two children who feature most prominently in this discussion are Maria Gabriela, who married Francisco Maria Castro of the great San Pablo land grant, and Jose de los Reyes. And then we see that they had Victor Castro, and they had many children, but Victor is going to feature prominently toward the end of this, and then Santos Berryessa. So they were first cousins. So that might be an important one to keep in mind, that Victor and Santos were first cousins as we progress. And like I said, I'll show these a little later on. Jose de los Reyes Berryessa was born in 1785 to Nicolas Berryessa and Gertrudis Peralta. He was their third child out of 9 and their oldest son. Nicolas was a soldado de cuera in the Spanish military and a member of the De Anza's second expedition. Reyes Berryessa appears to have been well educated for his time based on his ability to read and write, and his very clear and very beautiful penmanship. Additionally, we have evidence that he was employed by Lieutenant Ignacio Martinez as a schoolmaster for the children at the San Francisco Presidio for an annual salary of 70 pesos. In November of 1805, Reyes married Zacarias Bernal, the daughter of Joaquin Bernal and Josefa Sanchez. He was nearly 21, and she was only 14. Age differences such as this were very common for the time, in case you didn't know this. 1 year before their marriage, Reyes Berryessa enlisted with the Spanish military for a term of 10 years. He was described as being nearly, and this is common, this seems to be a common height for a lot of the soldiers. He was described as being nearly 4 feet, 8 inches tall, with black hair, brown eyes, a regular nose, clean shaven, and olive skin complexion. He had an illustrious career, and by the time he retired in 1830 of stomach pains, he had been promoted to sergeant. In 1842, Reyes was granted Rancho San Vicente by his nephew, who was a son-in-law of the Castros, Governor Juan Bautista Alvarado. Reyes and Zacarias had 13 children, one of them being Jose de los Santos Berryessa. Santos seems to have been a rather feisty and colorful character based on some recollections of the time. I'm still transcribing one that indicate there was some friction between Santos and General Vallejo. When he was born in 1817, they feared that he was going to die and was immediately baptized by Maria Guadalupe Briones instead of waiting to be taken to the church and baptized by the priest. When it was certain he would survive, he was taken to Mission San Francisco and was given the complete rites of baptism. Santos followed in his father's and his grandfather's footsteps by joining the Mexican military. Unfortunately, his filiación, which we looked at his father's just a moment ago, his is missing, but based on surviving revistas, which are the monthly reviews of the soldiers, we know that he had enlisted prior to 1837. Santos was also granted Rancho Mayacomes y Plano de Agua Caliente here in Sonoma County by Governor Manuel Michel Torena, which was located, as I said, here in Sonoma and in Napa. We'll look at this tree one more time as I talk about the De Haros now. And if you want, feel free to just kind of take this in a little bit. Like I said, it can be a little complex to try and sift through all the names. During the winter of 1825-26, Maria Zacarias Bernal de Berryessa and her first cousin, Maria Emiliana Sanchez de Haro, were both pregnant. And in July of 1826, Emiliana gave birth to her two twin sons, Mateo Francisco and Alejo Ramon Antonio. Their father, Juan Francisco de Haro, was a soldier in the Mexican military and was originally from the coastal state of Nayarit. Later, he would become the alcalde of Yerba Buena, which is now San Francisco. While only 15 years old, the two twin brothers were granted Rancho Potrero de San Francisco, a nearly 1,000-acre land grant situated in the present-day Potrero Hill, or Potrero, excuse me, I guess I should anglicize it a little bit, Potrero Hill neighborhood of San Francisco. The young men were full of life and amicable to all who knew them. Their cousin Juan Bernal described them as having a brave disposition, very kind, of unrivaled courage, and so familiar that even the same people who knew them often mistook them. In his 1918 San Francisco Bulletin article series titled Days of the Dons, Stephen Richardson remembered his childhood friends fondly. He said, "The De Haro brothers were two of the best-known young men in Alta California. They were twins, and though the likeness between the pair was not so striking, which kind of contradicts Bernal, they were noble-looking youths with a fine, manly bearing. Besides their physical gifts, they were known as well for their amiable characters, for their good manners, and their excellent personal habits. No entertainment was complete without the De Haro brothers, and at no house were they more welcome than at our own. Though they were 4 years my senior, our lives had much in common, and we were fast friends." I've not been able to corroborate this, but Richardson's sister apparently had been engaged to one of the De Haros, and of course we're going to learn about their demise in just a moment. That's something I'm still looking into and trying to determine if that was true or one of our California romantic past stories. In 1846, tension between the United States and Mexico came to its boiling point. On April 25th, 1846, the United States government declared war on Mexico. 2 months later, on June 14th, a ragtag group of men known as the Bear Flag Party captured the Pueblo of Sonoma and imprisoned the alcalde Jose de los Santos, along with his two brothers, Francisco and Ignacio. Shortly after Sonoma was captured, General Jose Castro began to raise forces under the command of Joaquin de la Torre, Jose Antonio Carrillo, and Manuel Castro to quell any advances by the Bear Flaggers. A few days later, a gruesome killing occurred. In addition to General Jose Castro's forces, a young saloon keeper named Juan Padilla gathered a renegade group of men to fight against the Bear Flaggers. On June 18th, two of the Bear Flaggers, Tom Cowie and George Fowler, were sent to Henry Fitch's Rancho Sotoyome to retrieve more gunpowder for their comrades in Sonoma. On the way, they were ambushed by Padilla and his gang and were brutally murdered. Newspapers could not even recount the situation in detail because of how gruesome the killings were. However, a nephew of Jose Reyes later recounted some of the details. He said, "It is said that Padilla and his followers committed terrible atrocities upon their victims, first taking them prisoners and tying them up to oak trees. They were skinned. They skinned them while alive, and in the case of one, before doing this, they cut off his male organs and gave it to him to chew." William Boggs, son of Missouri Governor Lilburn Boggs and friend of Kit Carson, also recalled some details. Padilla's men lassoed them and dragged them with their riatas to trees and lashed their bodies to the trees and literally tore their limbs from their bodies and cutting holes in their jaws, ran their ropes through and tore their jaws out and cut and mutilated their bodies, cutting off and putting portions of their own flesh in their mouths, and left the remains tied to the trees. This situation, as you can imagine, created deep animosity in the minds of the Bear Flaggers toward the Californios. From that moment forward, they would be looking for their chance to enact their revenge. Not many days later, they had the opportunity. Concerned about recapturing the Sonoma Presidio, General Jose Castro sent Captain Joaquin de la Torre to attack the Bear Flaggers. However, he quickly realized they would need more forces. Francisco Rico was directed to recruit more men from San Jose and bring them up to San Pablo. It was probably at this point when Francisco and Ramon de Haro joined them. It was also probably at this point when Jose de los Reyes began his journey to Sonoma to check on the welfare of his imprisoned sons. Word had reached the family at their home in Rancho San Vicente, and Maria Zacarias was worried they might have been harmed. When the recruited men arrived at Rancho San Pablo, it was determined that a volunteer should be sent to Sonoma with letters addressed to De La Torre, intended to distract the bear flaggers. One of the De Haro boys, we don't know which one, quickly volunteered, followed by his other brother. It was at the same moment that Jose Reyes appeared on the scene. In his recollections, Francisco Rico recalled that Jose Reyes appeared to me begging me to allow him to go in the same boat because his children were on the other side in grave danger, and he wanted to see how he could help them. I refused permission, but as he insisted, crying, I allowed him to embark. Rancho San Pablo was granted to Francisco Maria Castro, who was husband of Gabriela Berryessa, who was sister of Reyes Berryessa. I apologize again for all the names that are thrown out, and that sometimes it can be very difficult to keep all the connections, but this is an important one. Their two sons, the Castro sons, Victor and Gabriel Castro, owned a small boat and offered to ferry the three men across the bay to San Rafael. As they left, Francisco Rico kept watch through his telescope. When the three men disembarked from the boat, Rico saw three men approaching them, and he knew it was the enemy forces. There are conflicting reports, however, about what they saw. Francisco Rico recalled that Victor and Gabriel said they disembarked safely. However, Manuel Castro, in his recollection, recalled that the Indian servants who helped ferry them across reported seeing enemy forces confront them. The Americans were still furious over the death of their comrades, Cowie and Fowler. As Francisco, Ramon, and Jose Reyes disembarked from the boat, the bear flaggers had already been at Mission San Rafael for a day. They could see the three from their encampment at the mission. Some of the men notified Fremont that three enemy forces had just landed. Kit Carson asked, "What do you want us to do with them?" At this point, Fremont uttered his infamous words, "I have got no room for prisoners." Everyone knew what this meant. Jasper O'Farrell gave the following account 10 years later of what transpired. There was a boat landed three men at the mouth of the Estero on Point San Pedro, and as soon as they were described by Fremont, there were three men, of whom Kit Carson was one, detailed to meet them. They mounted their horses, and after advancing about 100 yards, halted, and Carson returned to where Fremont was standing on the corridor of the mission. In company with Gillespie, myself, and others, and said Captain Fremont, he said, "Captain Fremont, shall I take those men prisoners?" In reply, Fremont waved his hand and said, "I have got no room for prisoners." They then advanced to within 50 yards of the three unfortunate and unarmed Californians, alighted from their horses, and deliberately shot them. Other members of the Bear Flag Party shared their memories of what they witnessed. Nathan Coombs, the founder of Napa and a Bear Flagger, gave the following testimony. "What followed that day freezes the blood in my veins, the murder of the three Spaniards, for it could be called nothing but cold-blooded murder. From Coombs' perspective, Fremont was directly responsible for the murders because he permitted them to happen. Coombs was so repulsed by Fremont's behavior that he wrote, 'This last act of Fremont's, which I have spoken of, gave me such a dislike to him that I determined on my return to have nothing more to do with him.'" Another bear flagger named George Wyman recounted what he witnessed after the three were killed. Several onlookers and members of the bear flaggers gathered around the bodies while some stripped the men of serapes, calcineros, bandos, and sombreros. Some proposed that the bodies should be buried, but in an obvious parallel to the way in which Cowie and Fowler were treated, the group decided to leave the bodies unburied, saying, "The coyotes will eat them before the morning." Leaving the bodies unburied would have been considered both savage and a sign of incredible disrespect. The way in which the Americans treated the bodies of Jose de los Reyes and Francisco and Ramon de Haro was reciprocal to the manner in which Padilla and his men treated the mutilated remains of Tom Cowie and George Fowler. The difference between the two groups, however, was that Cowie and Fowler were enemy invaders, whereas Berryessa and the de Haros were innocent men. Eventually, some of the local Indians from Mission San Rafael buried their bodies in an unknown location. Among the group of men who gathered around the bodies was Stephen Richardson, who gave the description a little earlier of his two childhood friends. He recalled the scene later in life in devastating words. He said, "When I looked at the cold faces of my chums, the two men who had never an unkind thought against anyone in the world, everything I saw was red. Across a bridge of almost 75 years, I can still see that ghastly sight, and I still think of John C. Fremont as a willful murderer as I thought him then." Even after so many years, one can sense the emotion in Richardson's words. These were not merely, as was described in many newspaper articles, three Spaniards, but his dear friends. The following day, Fremont and his party returned to Sonoma, where Jose Santos and his brothers Ignacio and Francisco were still imprisoned. Upon their arrival at the barracks, news quickly spread about the murders. A few bear flaggers who spoke Spanish notified Jose Santos that his father was among those killed. Shaken by the news, Jose Santos confronted Fremont. He recalled later, "As he happened to stand in front of the room in which I was prisoner, now with two of my brothers, I spoke to him and asked him to tell me the truth, if my father had been killed. And he answered that it was not true, that the person who had been killed was a certain Castro." Despite Fremont's assurance, one of the Berryessa brothers saw their father Serape wrapped around the shoulders of one of the bear flaggers, which might have looked something like this, maybe like a saltillo, Mexican saltillo blanket. Recognized his father Serape, as I said, possibly an imported saltillo blanket from Mexico or some other high quality weaved blanket, bought maybe from New Mexico or maybe made by one of the local indigenous neophytes. Jose Santos asked Fremont to order his soldiers to hand over the serape, but Fremont refused, saying it was the booty he had won and he could keep it if he liked. Jose Santos was able to purchase a serape from the soldier, who asked for $25 for it. Kit Carson has become a major figure in the history of the American West. Prior to his involvement in the Bear Flag Revolt, he was a mountain man and a fur trapper. After the revolt, he was appointed as an Indian agent for the United States government and was based out of New Mexico. However, Carson's career was not necessarily unique. Carson biographer Tom Dunley noted that chance made him a celebrity and a symbolic hero. It was his chance encounter and friendship with Fremont that catapulted Carson into a national spotlight. Carson's popularity continued to rise after the production of his 1856 autobiography and into the 19th century with the introduction of dime novels. In his autobiographic material, Carson appears to skirt around the Berryessa de Haro murders. Only in passing does he address the Cowie Fowler murders, yet despite Carson's silence, William Montgomery, pictured here, was eager to hear his side of the story. William Boggs was the son of Missouri Governor Lilburn Boggs, and his brother was Thomas Boggs, a distant relative through marriage and close friend of Kit Carson. In his 1905 narrative, William remembered asking his brother Thomas during an 1849 visit about Carson's involvement in the Berryessa de Haro murders. Thomas replied that Carson was nowhere near the murder scene, and in fact was never in the San Francisco Bay during 1846. William was hesitant to push the matter further, saying, "Knowing my brother's friendship for Kit, I said no more about the matter." Either Thomas truly did not know that his close friend was involved in the murders, or he flat out refused to believe or acknowledge it out of a sense of loyalty. William was not satisfied, however, by his brother's confidence that Carson had no part in the murders. After the Boggs family arrived in Sonoma from Missouri, William quickly became acquainted with and developed lifelong friendships with several bear flaggers. Through these friendships, William shared that I had positive proof that Carson was on the north side of the bay in 1846, and I knew the men and others who were well acquainted with the circumstances. Many of these men, eyewitnesses to the murders, shared their memories of what transpired. The entire incident seems to have fascinated William, kind of like how it fascinates me. When he had the chance to ask Kit Carson himself during a visit to California in 1853, he seized the opportunity. William sat across from Carson in company with his brother Thomas when he asked him whether he was in San Rafael with Fremont during the time of the murders. Carson responded that he was. William then asked whether he and Granville Swift took prisoners. Carson again responded that they did. Pointedly, William stated, "And you killed them?" Carson responded, "Yes." No doubt many people wondered why Carson killed the three Californios. William asked the question that must have been on everyone's mind. Well, this is William's words. Well, what did you kill them for? You had them when you had them in your power. Carson responded that he was following orders from Fremont and just doing his duty. In Carson's own eyes, his hands were tied as Fremont subordinate, and the entire situation was an unfortunate event. Boggs did not outright condemn Carson, however, for his involvement, but he did indict him as the main perpetrator of the murders. One can sense deep feelings of conflict in William's words, no doubt because of Carson's close relationship with his brother Thomas. He said, "I was inclined to blame Kit Carson for what I thought to be a cold-hearted crime, having the men in their power. However, a little later in his narrative, he seems to exonerate him for the many brave and generous deeds he did, risking his life and going in dangerous journeys in pursuit of Indians to rescue white women and children at the risk of his life, without reward or compensation from any source. His was a noble soul, plain little brave Kit Carson, unassuming in manners." The reality of the events, juxtaposed with his close connection, must have created conflicting feelings about Kit Carson and the Californios. In his widely circulated letter, Jasper O'Farrell also noted Carson's remorse over killing Jose Reyes and the De Haro brothers. During a conversation with Carson, O'Farrell recalled that he assured me that then and since he regretted to be compelled to shoot these men and says he had intended to make them prisoners, but Fremont was bloodthirsty enough to order otherwise. Despite his silence on the murders in written communications, Carson seems to have expressed a sense of remorse when questioned in private conversation for his inability to defy Fremont's orders and to do what he believed was the right thing. Throughout his life, Fremont refused to acknowledge his responsibility in the murders of Jose Reyes and the De Haro twins, choosing to ignore the shameful event altogether. The only public acknowledgement he made was a brief statement in his 1887 Memoirs of My Life, in which he directly connects the Berryessa de Haro murders to the Cowie Fowler murders, essentially shirking any responsibility on his part. He wrote, "Both the settlers and the men of my command were excited against the Californians by the recent murder of the two Americans, and not by the murders only, but by the brutal circumstances attending it. My scouts, mainly Delawares, influenced by these feelings, made sharp retaliation and killed Berryessa and the De Haros, who were the bearers of intercepted letters." From this account, it appears that Jose Reyes and the De Haros were not murdered because they were suspected of carrying military correspondences to De La Torre, as some have suggested. Rather, they were murdered in retribution for acts committed by rebel Californio forces. And in a feeble attempt to exonerate himself, Fremont blamed the Delaware Indians among his men for stirring up emotions. If what William Boggs reported about Carson was accurate, then one must consider Fremont's own words. "With me, Carson and truth are one, and the truth appears to be a story of Fremont's revenge." In 1877, assistants of historian Hubert Howe Bancroft collected over 70 dictated interviews by various Californios for the purpose of helping him write his multi-volume History of California. The narratives were recorded primarily by Thomas Savage and Enrique Cerruti as a set of men and women who recalled their memories of events in California prior to statehood. These narratives have been vital in helping historians and myself understand the cultural, social, political, and religious dynamics of Spanish-Mexican California. The narratives record a wide range of emotions and relate differing understandings of the Berryessa de Haro and Cowie Fowler murders. Juan Bernal, who we quoted a little earlier today, remembered his brother-in-law, Jose Reyes, as a very honest man, very affectionate toward his family, very hardworking, with a sweet character, and also showed great courage in danger, as he made known on this occasion, dying with fortitude. Savage also interviewed Antonio Berryessa, a nephew of Jose Reyes and a cousin of Jose Santos. Antonio recounted in his Relación that from the time Jose de los Reyes Berryessa was murdered, his brother, my father, Antonio's father, who loved him very dearly, began to develop a melancholy state of mind so that he lost sleep and became very ill. As a result of the murders and other hardships that occurred in the 1840s and 1850s, Nicolas suffered from debilitating mental instabilities that led to his death in 1873. As close relatives, both interviewees shared their memories with great emotion as they remembered Jose Reyes, the de Haro brothers, and Fremont. In his lengthy narrative, Manuel Castro recalled what happened shortly after the murders. Captain Joaquin de la Torre rejoined General Jose Castro's forces and related the sad news to them of what happened. Manuel Castro reflected in his narrative that the three were worthy of a better fate, not being barbarously shot to death. Castro remembered Jose Reyes as a respectable old man, a son of Alta California, and the de Haro brothers as beautiful and patriotic twins. His written words are filled with incredible emotion as he remembered the night the soldiers learned the sad fate of their compatriots. He said, "Such news filled everyone in the camp with consternation. It was a night of deep meditation." The murders were a severe blow to the morale of the Californio forces. Castro continued, "It was not known until then whether the Sons of California would have to fight against savage hordes organized under the bear flag they had adopted, or whether they would have to fight with civilized soldiers." From this point forward, the war between the Californios and the bear flaggers took on a new meaning. The Berryessa de Haro murders would become a symbol of the violence committed by the Americans against the Californios throughout the second half of the 19th century. Typical of 19th century historians, Hubert Howe Bancroft attempted to remain neutral in his 1886 History of California. His primary motive was merely to present a comprehensive history of California prior to statehood. His purview did not include commentary or analysis as we as historians now typically present. Using the above narratives, Bancroft presented the Berryessa de Haro and Cowie Fowler murders within the history of the Bear Flag Revolt. However, and I found this to be very interesting, in a rare instance, Bancroft offered a lengthy commentary on the murders, saying in part, "The killing of Berryessa and the de Haros was a brutal murder like the killing of Cowie and Fowler, for which it was intended as a retaliation." Bancroft attempted to dispel many of the rumors and falsehoods that had circulated since the 1856 presidential election about the three Californios. He did not withhold his thoughts on the murders, saying, "They were given no chance for defense or explanation, but killed in cold blood at long rifle range. Viewed in its most favorable light, the act was one of cowardly vengeance." For a historian at this time, these were kind of strong words. As I mentioned, historians didn't typically offer commentary. So for me, when I read this, I thought it was very fascinating that Bancroft would actually go into his own views on this situation. Benjamin Kelsey was an early American settler who arrived with the Bidwell Bartleson party. He also condemned the murders. Benjamin and his wife Nancy, who is sometimes called the Betsy Ross of California for her involvement in making the bear flag, the actual bear flag, they were among the several individuals who made the arduous journey from Missouri in 1841. Ben was among the many men living in the northern part of the state who were recruited by Fremont for his California conquest. Nancy, as I said, has been called the Betsy Ross, and in his narrative, Kelsey recalled being at Mission San Rafael when Jose Reyes and the de Haro twins arrived on the beach. He called him Old Man Berryessa and said he was my close neighbor when I was at home. Ben must have met Jose Reyes on many occasions at Rancho Mayacomes, where the Berryessas would have offered the Kelseys their warmest hospitality. Fremont's men had intercepted details from an Indian man ordering De La Torre to attack Sonoma. According to Kelsey, additional information would soon be sent to Mission San Rafael. The letter that the de Haros carried most likely contained these additional details. Fremont decided to wait and watch for the Californios. At noon on June 28th, the de Haros and Jose Reyes landed on the beach as Fremont and all his men watched from afar. Another bear flagger named Thomas Martin claimed to have been the one who initially spotted them from a hill just beyond Mission San Rafael. Kelsey recalled all of this, seeing them walking up from the beach. He said, "We were looking at them through a large glass that Fremont had, and I saw that it was old man Berryessa. I knew him." Fremont initially turned to Kelsey and ordered him to go out and meet the three, saying, "You understand, before you go, that I don't want any live prisoners fetched to my camp." Kelsey responded, "Captain, then I understand you want, after going to see who they are, you want to kill them." The thought of killing his dear friend repulsed Kelsey and caused rift between him and Fremont. Kelsey told Fremont that he would have to find someone else to carry out his orders. Because they were friends of mine and my near neighbors and had done me many a good turn, I couldn't do that for him. Kelsey recalled that Fremont turned to Granville Swift and ordered him to go out and meet Jose Reyes and the de Haros. Absent from the narrative is Carson and his involvement, oddly enough. According to Kelsey, Swift was the one who carried out the orders. From a distance, the others could see the smoke from the rifles and then the men falling to the ground. Some of the men commented, "What a cowardly act," since neither Jose Reyes nor the de Haros were armed. Thomas Martin recalled that the bodies laid on the beach for 3 or 4 days as we passed and repassed them. Kelsey resented Fremont for the rest of his life. The murders of Jose de los Reyes and Ramon and Francisco de Haro became a symbol of the tragedies that would befall the Spanish-Mexican Californios in the succeeding decades. The incident quickly changed sentiments toward the Americans and commenced an era of devastating loss, which it left a lasting impact on their collective memory. Speaking over 70 years later, Stephen Richardson recalled, "The story of the murders with their accompanying atrocity sparked like wildfire among the Californians, from the most remote hacienda of the north to San Diego. It was the Lusitania incident of those troubled times. The people might have condoned the overbearing conduct of Fremont. They might have overlooked the gross outrage involved in the Vallejo raid, but the killing of the de Haro boys and poor old Berryessa seemed to stir all the bitterness and hate of a kind-hearted people to the very dregs." Californians throughout the state knew about the murders, which contributed to their negative view of the Americans. Historian Rosaura Sanchez comments on how both the Berryessa de Haro and the Cowie Fowler murders shaped each other's identity group. She said, "There would be other deaths, but these two cases have become fixed in the history of each national group as proof of the other's savagery." Throughout the 1850s, the plight of the Spanish-Mexican Californios worsened as Americans and other foreign migrants began to inundate the state in search of fortune and gold. The vast ranchos of the newly conquered territory became highly coveted by men seeking to become rich. During this period, most of the Californios lost their lands to squatters and their wealth to court and lawyer fees in an attempt to defend their property rights. Many Californios were unable to successfully engage a new legal system that worked against them. English also complicated matters. As a result, Americans viewed the Californios and American views of the Californios they viewed them as racially and culturally inferior. They were no longer the elite of California society. They had become racialized as Mexicans and greasers in the eyes of their conquerors. Of this period, Leonard Pitt wrote, "While the gringos canonized Fremont as a hero of the conquest, the lordly Berryessas were dogged by one Yankee injustice after another until they were completely decimated." He likened them to a Spanish tragedy. Again, Rosaura Sanchez wrote, "Of all the episodes narrated about the invasion and sporadic acts of resistance, In the North, two stand out and set the stage for what will be ensuing years of oppression, intolerance, racism, and lynching, the killing of Jose Berryessa and the de Haro brothers, and the killing of Cowie and Fowler. The 1846 Berryessa de Haro murders commenced a series of devastating events that would thrust not only the Berryessas, but many other California families to the bottom of the social ladder, displacing them from their status as landowners and influential citizens. In the midst of these devastating calamities, the Berryessas were forced to relive the decade-old memory of the murders in the public forum. Nearly 600 miles to the south of Mission San Rafael in 1856, a bitter war of words erupted between two ideologically opposed Los Angeles newspaper editors. Running on an abolitionist platform as a first-ever Republican candidate for the presidency in 1856, Fremont was endorsed throughout California by politicians and newspaper editors, including Francisco Ramirez, the young 19-year-old of the year-old Spanish-language periodical El Clamor Público, the Public Clamor. In the August 9th edition, Ramirez proudly endorsed Fremont at the top of the first column on the second page. Despite Fremont's violent 1846 foray into California and his attacks on the Californios, Ramirez campaigned diligently on his behalf, eager to witness the abolition of slavery and the advancement of his own people. With all the enthusiasm of a young 19-year-old, Ramirez was a progressive in the midst of a democratic bastion. On the same day that Ramirez printed his endorsement of Fremont, Henry Hamilton published an editorial in his recently acquired newspaper, the Los Angeles Star, threatening to oppose the atrocities that Fremont had committed against the Californios. He said, "We intend to lay certain facts before the people, known to many here, but the pressure on our space prevents us doing so this week. There will be abundant opportunities for doing so before November." Hamilton, who had recently arrived in California from Ireland by way of New Orleans, was a particularly staunch Southern Democrat and ardent supporter of slavery, a sentiment which was held by the majority of Los Angeles residents. A few weeks later, on September 6, Hamilton made good on his promise and printed an anonymous account of the more heinous acts that Fremont had committed during his conquest of California, including the murder of Jose Reyes and the de Haro twins. This appears to be the first time that the murders were leveraged in the editorial feuds of the 1856 presidential election, and the first time they came into broad public view. Subsequent articles were printed in newspapers and periodicals as far away as Ohio, Connecticut, New York, and Washington, D.C. On September 23rd, the editors of the San Francisco Herald published two bombshell letters that indicted Fremont as a cold-blooded killer. The first was authored by none other than Jose Santos himself in response to rumors that he would use his platform to campaign on behalf of Fremont to the Spanish speakers of Northern California. The second letter was authored by Jasper O'Farrell, an eyewitness to the murders. The two letters were subsequently reprinted in several other state and regional newspapers as evidence to disqualify Fremont from the presidency. The murders were just one of many accusations hurled against Fremont, including accusations of him being, oh my goodness, a Roman Catholic. Just 4 days later, on September 27th, Hamilton printed a rebuttal in response to critiques made by Ramirez in the September 13th edition of El Clamor Público. Hamilton reprinted both the Berryessa letter and the O'Farrell letter in his editorial response. He prefaced them by appealing to the emotions of the Californios, stating, "We are pained to open the recollection of the bloody tragedy in San Rafael." When I'm reading these newspapers, often I'm trying to put myself in the sense of how they're writing it. And when I read this, I was sensing that there was a certain bit of glee, even though Hamilton is saying it pains me, but I'm sure he was rather gleeful to have this type of evidence to leverage against his opponents. O'Farrell concluded his letter that was reprinted by saying, "I should not have taken the trouble of making this public, but that the veracity of a pamphlet published by C.E. Pickett, Esquire, in which he mentions the circumstances, has been questioned, a history which I am compelled to say is, alas, too true. The pamphlet to which O'Farrell referred was one entitled, this is a very lengthy title, maybe not as lengthy as others from the time period, but the title is John C. Fremont, Character, Achievements, and Qualifications for the Presidency, semicolon, and other matters connected therewith. This was published by Charles Edward Pickett. While Pickett did not specifically name Jose Reyes and the De Haro twins in his pamphlet, all who read it would have been familiar with the incident that he described. He charged Fremont as guilty of, quote, a very inhumane and bloody act. Pickett briefly recounts the same narrative that O'Farrell offered in his letter. While the pamphlet was most likely written in California for Californians, it was referenced in several newspapers outside of the state, and its effects felt throughout the country. This is one of the more interesting situations of this entire editorial feud, this next part, but committing a faux pas so embarrassing that it bordered on the comedic. The editor of the Sacramento Daily California Times published an article in late September in which they condescendingly stated that Don Jose Santos Berryessa, a very talented native Californian, would address the people of the northern counties in favor of Fremont and Dayton, and that he would stump the lower counties on Fremont's behalf. In response to this laughable claim, the editor of the Nevada Democrat reprinted part of a letter on October 1st written by Jose Santos, in which he sarcastically concluded, I leave it to the reader to say how ardent must be my support of Colonel Fremont and how many speeches I ought to make in his favor. The Los Angeles Star feigned even greater offense at this, adamantly defending Jose Santos as a staunch Democrat. Hamilton wrote in his editorial, quote, the fact is, this gentleman is a good Democrat, and of course a staunch supporter of Buck and Breck. And if he takes the stump at all, it will be to promote among his fellow countrymen the success of the Democratic Party. The response reiterated Fremont's involvement in the murders and pointed out how preposterous it would be for Jose Santos to endorse his father's murderer. Following the initial printing of the O'Farrell letter, Republican newspaper editors throughout the state and on the East Coast solicited counter-narratives to exonerate Fremont and his involvement in the murders. On September 24th, the day after the Herald published the letter, the San Francisco German-language paper, Star of Empire, printed a letter by Alexander Godet in their English section in which he ardently defended his friend as superior. In his letter, he places the blame squarely on the three Californios for resisting arrest. He said, had they submitted and not attempted to escape, they would have received no harm, but they furnished a pretext which, to the friends of Tom Cowie, was perhaps not welcome. The latter part of his quote reveals the real sentiment that lay at the heart of this entire matter. Had Juan Padilla and his gang not killed Tom Cowie and George Fowler in such a heinous manner, Jose de los Reyes Berryessa and Francisco and Ramon de Haro would have been spared from the anger of the bear flaggers. Despite being widely circulated, the letter did little to exonerate Carson or Fremont in the court of public opinion. Republican editors were eager to discredit the murder narrative. Among them, no one else was more eager than young Francisco Ramirez. In their attempt to do so, they scrutinized those closest to Jose Santos. Ramirez must have been overjoyed when he printed the October 11 edition of El Clamor Público. In this particular editorial column, he published a letter dated September 8th, in which 28 well-respected Californians signed their names endorsing Fremont and expressing their excitement for his presidency. Among those listed supporting Fremont were Ignacio Berryessa and Nicolas Berryessa. With the cocky attitude of a 19-year-old, Ramirez highlighted the two as, quote, brother and cousin of Jose de los Santos Berryessa. This was an obvious antagonistic move aimed at harming Jose Santos's credibility. By showing that other Berryessa family members were supporters of Fremont, Ramirez was attempting to depict Jose Santos as a disgruntled Democrat who held a personal vendetta against the presidential candidate. The list of Californios was not the only piece printed to discredit Jose Santos. The October 11th edition also included a published letter that had been circulated for about 2 weeks by Victor Castro. On September 26, the Sacramento Daily California Times published a letter written by Castro, who was nephew of Reyes Berryessa. For Fremont's allies, the letter was the type of evidence they had hoped to gain to dispute O'Farrell's claims. The letter was especially helpful for Republicans since it refuted Fremont's direct responsibility for the killings by none other than one of the victims' close relatives. In the letter, Castro recounts how he was the commanding officer of the militia in Contra Costa and in charge of the boats within the Bay of San Pablo. Additionally, he says that it was his boat in which Berryessa and the De Haro twins, carrying military dispatches for De La Torre, sailed across the bay, and that he manned the boat to and from San Rafael. In his recollection of the incident, Mariano Vallejo also confirmed that Victor manned the boat that carried the three to San Rafael. Castro concluded his brief letter by saying, quote, "As much as I lamented the loss of my relative and of my countrymen, truth compels me to say that no act of Colonel Fremont belied the conduct of a distinguished military officer, humane and gentlemanly in his private and public intercourse with the native Californians," end quote. With a sense of glee, you can feel the glee from Francisco Ramirez when he printed the letter in the October 11th edition of El Clamor Público. He prefaced the letter by saying, "With Godet's letter, this should seal the lips of every man who has uttered the base charge of murder against J.C. Fremont." End quote. Castro's letter was reprinted in several other newspapers throughout the state and the East Coast. A letter by William Finley also circulated, attesting to the veracity of Victor Castro's letter. Finley refers to the murders as a melancholy tragedy, but comes short of placing the blame on Fremont. In the latter part of his letter, Finley took a sarcastic tone when discussing the veracity of Jasper O'Farrell's letter, saying, "I can only say that that gentleman's sense of hearing must be very acute," suggesting that O'Farrell was nowhere near the murder scene when it happened. Back to this chart so we can see how Victor and Jose Santos and Jose Reyes all relate. Once again, Jose Reyes would have been his uncle and Jose Santos would have been his cousin. Democrat newspaper editors were quick to counter Victor Castro's narrative. Responding to the letter nearly a month later, the editor of the Placerville Mountain Democrat points out that at the time of the murders, Victor Castro was separated from San Rafael by about 20 miles of water, having returned to San Pablo immediately after the three disembarked. Seizing upon the sentiments of his readers, the editor continues to paint a sympathetic picture of Jose Reyes by saying, "Who ever heard of such a thing as shooting down an old man who is peaceably approaching an enemy's encampment without affording him time even to say the Lord's Prayer?" With subtle racist undertones, the editor finished his commentary by saying, "We forgive Castro because of his extreme ignorance and almost inability to write." The unknown editor's comments revealed the duplicitous nature of the Americans during this period. As long as the narrative serves their agenda, Californios were noble, hospitable, and talented. However, when the narrative did not work in their favor, Californios were considered ignorant and illiterate. On November 4th, 1856, Americans elected Democratic candidate James Buchanan as the 15th president of the United States, rejecting John Charles Fremont and his abolitionist platform. Despite being one of the first two elected senators from California, Fremont failed to secure all four of the state's electoral votes. The editorial claims that he was beloved among the Californios proved to be wrong. Only two Spanish-Mexican Californios served as electors, and their votes were pledged to James Buchanan. According to the historian Andrew Roll, Fremont made a poorer showing in California than nationally, gaining only 20,000 votes out of 91,000. While the Berryessa de Haro murders were not the primary detriment to his success, the collective memory of all Californians certainly played a crucial role in his monumental defeat. Bancroft summed up the 1856 election by writing, "In justice to Fremont, it is fair to say that the testimony was first publicly given during the political campaign of 1856, at a time when prejudice was generally more potent than love of truth. But justice also requires me to call attention to the fact that Fremont has never, so far as I know, denied the accuracy of O'Farrell's assertions. Based on Bancroft's observations, the O'Farrell letter may have been one of the most ruinous pieces of evidence for Fremont's victory." To this day, no effort has been made to locate the graves of José de los Reyes Berryessa and Francisco and Ramon de Haro. No effort has been made to erect a monument to their memory. The three men were innocent Californios who were given no chance to defend themselves. Their deaths were enacted out of revenge. The Berryessa de Haro murders not only contributed toward Fremont losing the presidency, they also helped to forge an ethnic identity through the collective memory and commenced a period of unprecedented hardship for the Californios. In regard to the incident, historian William Wilkinson wrote, "This and other actions by Fremont forever blackened his name in the ranks of the Californios." The death of an old man and his two adolescent nephews was the beginning of an era of tragedy that would befall the Californios once Alta California was seized by the United States. Recalling the sentiments of the Californios some 70 years later, Stephen Richardson wrote, "The Spanish-speaking people of the 1850s and 60s might have their individual American cronies or intermarry with them, but of the race as a whole, they remembered only Fremont's barbarian horde and the two de Haro twins, with old Berryessa weltering in their blood." Sadly, the living memory of California descendants has essentially forgotten the story of the murders and is only recalled occasionally in the local history sections of small town newspapers. In its place, a whitewashed fantasy past created by fictional stories such as Helen Hunt Jackson's Ramona replaced real histories of real people. For Californios in the 19th century and early 20th century, memory was inextricably linked to one's sense of belonging within American society and culture, and the ability to negotiate one's own identity. In a small way, retelling these stories brings them back to life and returns their lost identity as California martyrs.